You're listening to the Primal Happiness Show, a podcast dedicated to helping you thrive in this crazy modern world. Every Tuesday, we explore the nature of how our minds really work, what exactly the human animal requires to thrive, and how we can live happier and more fulfilling lives. If you're new here and haven't yet taken our free class, then there's no better place to get a jump start on reclaiming your primal happiness. It's where we'll guide you step by step through our antidote to today's modern world. Simply head on over to primalhappiness.co/antidote to get the free class and discover how to thrive without having to move to a planet that's not so crazy as ours. But now, your host, Leanne Brook-Tyler.
Hello, my beautiful people. A huge warm welcome back to the show. In today's crazy modern world, men and women are living shallow, disconnected, and unfulfilling lives. So we created the path for those who are ready to reclaim their primal power and actualize their deepest gifts. If you're feeling ready to go deeper with myself and Jonathan, go along to primalhappiness.co/go deeper. Or you can book a free exploration call with one of us at primalhappiness.co/exploration. And we have a brand new offering that we will be releasing very soon. It's called Waking the World Sovereign, and it's very much the pinnacle of our work. It's the deepest, most intimate, and most impactful way that you can work with us. I'll be sharing more on that very soon, but if you want to be sure to get a heads up on it as soon as it's coming out, go along to primalhappiness.co/go deeper and get your exploration call booked. And now onto this week's show. It's with the wonderful Mark Walsh. Mark is the founder of the Embodied Facilitator Course, Embodied Yoga Principles, the Embodiment Podcast, and the Embodiment Conference, a groundbreaking event attended by over 15,000 people worldwide. With an honours degree in psychology, 20 plus years of yoga experience, and an aikido black belt, he has dedicated his life to embodied learning. These days, he teaches and mentors young embodiment teachers all over the world. So it's not clear from Mark's bio. He is just the absolute, I'm struggling to find the right word, but just incredible on this topic of embodiment. Really, really happy to have Mark on the show. So in this conversation, Mark and I explored the incredibly juicy topic of why embodiment is connection, and conversely, why disembodiment is disconnection. Mark shared the 5 ways we can be connected and gave some beautifully clear, practical ways you can increase your connection, or differently put, your embodiment. Let's dive in. Hello, Mark. Welcome to the show.
Pleased to be here.
Oh, me too. And it's gone from me thinking, this could be a juicy topic, to me really, really excited and ready to dive in just from our free chat. I'm really looking forward to this.
Great. I've had a really nice morning as well. You've got me super chilled. I had a morning off and I went for a sauna and a swim, nice hotel, and then my book just arrived in the post. And it was like, it's like the final check copy, and it has the publisher sort of, and I was a bit worried about how it would be, and that it looks really nice. So I'm you've got me in a super good mood, basically. So let's have a nice chat.
Wonderful. So you said something that really literally made me sit up and take notice as we were chatting about the topic. And I'm going to really butcher this and paraphrase it terribly, but you said something like, connection is embodiment and disembodiment is disconnection. And there was something in, that seems really simple, but there was something really profound in that I suddenly it was like something shifted at a deeper level of being able to see this. So yes, how have you arrived at that, amazingly sort of profound simplicity of seeing that connection?
Yeah. Well, the first thing I'd say is that well done on your own embodied skill that you noticed that, you picked up on straight away that there was a shift in your own body. You were like, okay, something resonates for me here. And, not everybody has that skill still. That's lost for so many people. So that's my first of all was like, okay, great. I'm being interviewed by someone who actually gets what I do for a change. This is really nice. So that was my first feeling when you kind of said that. So one way I get interviewed a lot and I get asked, what is embodiment? And there's lots of ways to explain that. One really nice way I like these days is talking about 5 different disconnects. So the primary one in embodiment is disconnected from yourself. So out of contact with oneself. And that has really profound implications beyond which it might not be obvious. Like, why is it necessary to feel? Well, it's the basis of knowing how we are. It's the basis of knowing ourselves. It's the basis of our humanity. This sense I get from so many people in the modern world that they're moving so fast, they're working so hard, they're so tech addicted that they're really not in contact with themselves as human beings. And that is profoundly bad for their health, also bad for their relationships. We can think of as another disconnect, in that if we're not connected to ourselves, to be connected to other people is very difficult.
Yeah, impossible, I'd say. In fact, you just to back you up slightly, this might be a tangent too far, I know. But when you're saying disconnected to themselves, can you just define which kind of, clearly there's so many versions of that word self and so many places you could point. Would you mind to give me a kind of snapshot of what you mean when you say self?
I don't want to go into the philosophy of it, because that will definitely be I tend to be a very pragmatic guy. So I tend to see it as a skill set. So it's simply, are you aware of your body? And are you aware of your breath right now? Are you aware of your posture right now? Are you aware of your muscular tonality, your emotional moods? Are you aware of all these different things right now? And everybody's unconsciously embodied. We're all a set of habits which have been solidified amongst the things I just mentioned: posture, breath, movement, etc. But you can become more aware of those things, both in the moment, and which is more equivalent with mindfulness, and then over longer time frames, which isn't the same as mindfulness. You can't be mindful of your personality, but you can become aware of your habitual embodiment, which is very close, and then the ability to shift those things. And again, this is where it may be, the subtitle of the book is Moving Beyond Mindfulness, because it's like, it's nice to be aware, but don't we also want to, if I wasn't in such a good mood today, if I was in a grumpy mood, how would I shift that? Because I don't want to be in a grumpy mood when I'm having an interview, So, how do we shift ourselves long term?
Yes.
So
there's a chronic and an acute kind of way that could show up.
Exactly. So there's a short-term awareness and a short-term shift, and that's of self. And then we can go to other, which is, maybe being a bit aware of, we're aware of each other. There's some empathy there. This is the basis of ethics. This is the basis of intimacy. This is the basis of friendship, basis of us communicating even on that level. Again, that's embodied. And then longer term, if I'm coaching you or whatever, it might be, what patterns do you have that may be more or less helpful? I was just in the workshop of a teacher. They had this like slightly annoyed, berating tone every time they spoke. And it was very subtle, but everyone was picking up on it on at least an unconscious level. And I'd be able to identify exactly what that was and be able to say, look, do you realize that you're embodying this and this isn't going to help your career? And then it's, as a coach, it's how do I then develop people, or, when I'm doing leadership trainings or working with yoga teachers, how do you do that in a yoga class? So what I've just walked through there is the sort of skill sets of what could be called embodied intelligence. It's awareness and choice, self and other. Choice becomes influence with others. And there's pretty big consequences to not having that skill set. And we all have it to some degree, but it can be massively enhanced through training and through lifestyle and community and other things.
Wow. Okay. Love that.
Lots there.
Yeah. I'm just kind of like, sort of eating it up a bit for a
chewing
moment.
On it. Yeah. You're continually chewing on it. So as an embodiment teacher, I'm looking at you chewing on it and I'm going, okay, give the poor woman some space before you add dessert. Do you know what I mean? It's like, just chewing on it, there's a lot there.
I love that. It's interesting because I had an embodiment teacher, trainer on a few weeks ago, Dylan Newcomb. And it was interesting because his preference was this word skills too.
Dylan's very good. He's a friend and a colleague And he's probably one of the smartest embodiment teachers in the world. Dylan's really very good.
Oh, lovely. We know so many people in common. And yet
we do actually, including local friends of mine and from men's group people I know. And I was like, wow, I totally want to be on this podcast. My secretary set it up and I was really happy with it when I saw it.
Oh, great. So I really dig Dylan too, just to say, but I find it interesting that you're both using this word skill. I was noticing that was like hooking my attention. There's something about the word skill that for me, and it might just be my own definition of this, just to be clear. So hence why I suppose I'm asking you. For me, a skill is something that we're almost like consciously practicing into, rather than it being a kind of like an expansion to a new normal. I'd just love to know how you're holding that.
Yeah, I mean, I like it because it's pragmatic. I've done a lot of work in business, a lot of work in war zones, a lot of work with kids. I tend to work with I'm from a martial arts background, so I tend to like the pragmatic. And that approach, as I said, when I'm working with, say, business trainers and coaches, that's pretty accessible for them.
Yes.
It's not the only way. I mean, I sometimes just go full poetic, like talking about coming home to the body. It's a very poetic way of talking about it. Or just go full experiential, just skip the skill sets and this skill and that set and just go straight into, the subjective aspect of the body is another definition of embodiment. So going into the subjective, into the experience would be another one. And we've all had an experience of being disembodied in the sense of cut off from ourselves. And we're never 100% disembodied, not ghosts. And then we've all had the experience of being more in our bodies, and we've all seen someone who's like a charismatic leader because they're embodied, or really sexy because they're embodied. So this is, in some ways, I sometimes present this as like, you already know this. Like, this is pretty common sense. Like, my niece could like cold read embodiments of people by the time she was 3 or 4. And she could tune in to whether it was a good idea to ask Uncle Mark for some pocket money, or whether it was a good idea to ask me to read her another story or something, right? Like, it's pretty intuitive body skill. So that's another way of. I find when I talk about embodiment, if you just try one of these approaches, it's not enough. So, like, in writing about it recently, I decided to opt for 4 things: sets of experiences, theory, stories from my own life, and poetry. And it was like a new type of book. It was like, at first I was like, is this going to work? And people that have read it said it does work because it evokes what embodiment is. In the same way as my voice, I hope, invokes it. In the same way as reading about it, hearing stories. So yeah, we can try and define it, but then you end up almost killing it with definition.
Yes, because the whole point is an experiential experience.
Yeah. That's at the heart of it.
Yeah, completely. So going back to that first place that we were at, where we were talking about embodiment is connection. I'm going on the idea, as I'm inviting you to like know that, our listeners are a really smart, conscious bunch. So I'm about to say this and it's going to sound like a really dumb question, but it's because I feel there could be sometimes it's in that, like, it's in the dumb questions that we get to see something deeper. I'm not saying this because my listeners aren't going to know this, but again, it's for that reason. I think there could be some depth here. Why would we even want to be connected? What's so important about being connected that you see?
In a way, I think my tribe, my audience, my customers, my people, that would be so obvious to them already that I wouldn't bother to answer it. Now, I don't want that to be a cop-out, so I'm going to answer it. But if someone said to me, why do I want to be connected to myself? I would be like, okay, cool, enjoy your life. Because I think there's something in who do we really want to connect with? And there's a place where if people aren't that far along already, then I just kind of would be nice to them and not bother.
Yeah, it's almost, and hence why I prefaced it by saying I'm about to ask you like the dumbest question ever.
However, I'm also aware that I get put in rooms with people, my HR managers, I get put in rooms with people who this isn't obvious to, and I need to sell it to them. And I've got pretty good at that over the years, particularly doing corporate work. So I'd link it to health for some people. The idea that if you don't know when you've hit a wall, you don't know your own limits, you're going to keep pushing yourself beyond that which is not only healthy, but not sane. And that's just increasingly, people get that when I explain that to them. I say, how do you feel at the end of the day when you've been on your emails, been on your computer for hours? Do you feel good? No. Okay. How does that affect your health? Not great. How does that impact your relationships with other people when you're cut off from yourself? And they'll be like, yeah, not great. I find it hard to connect with my wife. We have our best sex when we're on holiday and we're relaxed and we're swimming in the sea and we're in our bodies. And then we have our best emotional conversations, our best physical conversations, and they get that. So you can kind of remind people of that thing. Or sometimes I do it experientially. I'll kind of like a little body language tricks, which is not the same, but I'll take my hands and I'll say, right, everybody touch your knees. And as I say that, I'll touch my elbows. And then everybody will touch their elbows and not their knees. Unless they're really paying attention. And I say, so you listen to my body more than my words. And if they're leaders, maybe they're in a narrative of nonverbal communication, which is much more shallow, but is a way in. Or they're in a narrative of emotional intelligence. And I say, well, can you really be emotionally intelligent if you're cut off from yourself? Because that's the basis of your empathy. That's where your feelings are. Your feelings have geography. So there's some ways in, depending on the person, it's really quite different. But mostly people are hitting walls already. No one comes to me and says, my life's really perfect. Can I book you for some coaching? They come because they've got an issue. And it might be, why am I, a Russian executive on the plane saying, why can I not find a good man? I want a certain kind of man and I can't find one. Why not? You're a coach, you're a psychologist, you tell me. And I'm like, great, she's got a problem. There's an opening here, And I think in that particular woman's case, I said, well, do you want a bee or a flower? She's like, well, I like real men. It's in her cultural background. She's wanting that. I said, great. So do bees like flowers or other bees? And then I just went back to my book and let her think about that for a while. And if she was wanting coaching, I could then give her some embodied coaching exercises on developing her flow and her openness and actual practical things to develop that side of herself if she wanted to. But my basic frame with embodiment is learning, like Dylan's, I would say, actually, which is I'm not trying to fix people or say people should be a certain way or they're broken. My attitude is just like, look, you've got an embodiment. How's that working out for you? Do you want more range? Do you want more choice? If so, here's some stuff we can work on. If not, also fine,
Yeah, no, it makes complete sense. So I'm definitely feeling my attention get drawn to something that we said we'd touch on around
we can go there.
Polarity relationships, men, women. But I'm just going to pause there for the moment. And I'm just thinking about the aspects you were just talking about, and what I was really present to was when I come from a corporate background. So as you were talking about kind of, selling this into corporates, for example, and I was thinking, that's so true what you were saying about when people have been doing various training stuff around emotional intelligence and understanding other people better, communicate. Quite often, almost always, the bit around self is missing. And I've only just seen that as clearly as I just have. Like, it's so funny how much is focused around managing out there before even understanding what's going on in here.
Yeah, we always say with embodied intelligence, emotional intelligence is a subset of that you need to start with yourself, because you can't really listen to people unless you can regulate yourself, and you can't regulate yourself unless you're self-aware. So there is a particular order to these things, I'd say generally. And when I'm training, we have a year-long course for coaches, for example, and half of it is just on the coach's self-awareness and building the coach's own embodied presence. Like, that has to come first before they can learn. Whether it's coaches or corporate leaders, they often want tricks and tools, and I get that, and I like to give people I can give people really practical tools. That's fine. But what really underpins it or undermines it is the embodiment someone has, the being someone is. If the embodiment is your way of being, your bodily way of being, which is communicated and comes across and is constructing who you are. So that's going to either undermine or enhance whatever you're doing, which is why this is so universal. There's almost nothing that can't be done an embodied version of. Because whatever even if you're typing emails or whatever, you're still from an embodiment. your perception's embodied, your thinking's embodied. So this absolutely underpins any kind of tricks and tips and skills. And, like I just sometimes joke, Wikipedia hasn't solved the world's problems. Or like in business, you meet someone with who's got an MBA, but they can't lead. So it's not really about information. That's not what matters. And this is common sense, right? Like I sometimes I make this joke that like if someone said I'd read a lot of books on kissing, does that make them a great lover? We all get that that's ridiculous, right? So, I think in some ways the embodied paradigm is sort of, on the one hand, it goes against Western kind of, we could call cognocentric culture, the privileging of the cognitive, but it also in other ways is just pure common sense.
Yeah. It's just coming to me how you're right. I think on this like Western, like typical kind of personal growth path, the body isn't seen as important, or embodiment isn't seen important. But then I think there's also that more kind of spiritual non-dual path where it's not seen as important.
Yeah.
And however, I'm finding more and more that it's seeping its way and creeping its way into all of these other places that it wasn't before, which I find like wonderful and really interesting. It seems, I don't think it's just because that's what's in my awareness, but I wonder if you're noticing the same, that suddenly people are starting to take notice of this.
I mean, hashtag embodiment for all, sometimes it's just an avocado salad, but, that is trending. We did the embodiment conference last year for the first time and 15,000 people turned up. I mean, we weren't expecting that.
Wow.
We thought maybe 3,000, an online conference. And we think we'll get at least 100,000 next year.
Goodness.
May end up being the biggest educational event in human history. So it's clearly trending. Like you see the word in yoga more, you see it around coaching and training more. I think things are moving, and the whole world is moving in this direction. And in some ways, I'm sort of giving it a name, talking about the embodiment movement, really, not just it's the conference and the book and the course and the yoga, but it's really a movement. It's really something that's a groundswell. And what it's not, you put your finger on this. One, there's a sort of kind of a Cartesian Western tradition where, as a professor friend of mine said, my body just carries my head from one lecture to the next. We have, as Philip Shepherd, an embodiment teacher's point out, we have chief executive officers. This is very cognitive. Captain. This comes also from head. In terms of all our language around leadership is to do with head. So it's in our Western culture for sure, and also in the alternative culture, there can be a sort of spiritual bypassing of sort of messy and somehow emotional or unpleasant. I'm not an expert on spirituality, so I tend not to speak much about it, but I've definitely seen a sort of love and light denial of the body. Trauma is another factor that help. People deny their body for all sorts of reasons. And
totally.
Reasons,
Yeah, it can be just too painful to go there for some people at a certain point. But yes, I think my background into this work more broadly, was the kind of more spiritual path. And I think in some ways it can be the body and the ego is almost collapsed as the both things that you want to escape.
Yeah.
Versus the body being a kind of a path to really anything that you want to do, anything you want to create. So I find this interesting actually, because we're on the one hand saying this is something that's growing and in people's awareness more and more. And yet there's also this, I guess, controversy right now that is, I guess, on the one hand, if we're saying our bodies and how we've embodied in this particular lifetime is becoming increasingly important. Yeah. On the other hand, we've got this growing narrative of our bodies aren't important, it's how we identify. Mm-hmm. So it's interesting, isn't it? Quite often is the case. You get kind of two contrasting viewpoints going on at the same time. And I know when we spoke, this for the embodiment world right now is going to become almost like I don't know if it'll be a part of the ways or what, but I'd love to hear what you have to say on that.
Yeah, there's it's a whole topic. That's the first thing to say. It's not a safe topic to speak about.
No, and I really appreciate your willingness to even go there.
Be very, very careful what they say. Let's start with points of agreement. So I think we're living in a time when things are less readily defined in traditional ways. And there's a really good part of that in terms of people that may have been marginalized, that haven't had a great time of it historically, starting to be recognized more. Mm-hmm. And not everyone fits neatly into boxes. And, as someone who doesn't fit into many boxes, that I can really understand and go, okay, I really understand why no one wants to be forced into a box. And we're living in a time of sort of freedom around some of these things and a breaking of some of the old containers, maybe an overly breaking. The conservative side of me is concerned with the breaking of containers, because containers exist for a reason. Most things that have been done have done because they worked, not because they were abusive, but because they worked. So, if you take a car engine and just randomly throw a piece out, you probably won't improve it. Or a human body, unless it's the appendix you happen to take out and that you just got lucky, you're probably not going to get away with taking a part of the human body. So this is the conservative side of me. And the liberal side of me, which is probably the bigger side, actually still in many ways, kind of goes, well, yes, but it's about acceptance and openness. And the embodiment world has always been quite accepting and open. I think on the whole, there's subsets. Like the martial arts world is a bit one way, the dance world is a bit another. And it's always been sort of West Coast led. And there is a very particular politics that's come out of West Coast American universities, which has spread far and wide now. You'll see it in Hollywood, you'll see it in the tech sector. And this particular politics has a view of the importance of subjectivity, which makes sense because previous to that, we had modernism, and modernism saw things in terms of only what's objective. The sort of Ford factories, and it's only what you can measure matters. And that's obviously bullshit. There's obviously more to this feeling. Embodiment's all about that. Embodiment's all about uniqueness. It's all about change. It's not just about the numbers and the facts and the external reality. So again, though, like all swingbacks, they can go too far, right? So if we say the physical doesn't matter at all, well, that's clearly nonsense. If we say the body doesn't matter at all, at this point, now I'm going, okay, then how do we do embodiment? Like, surely, but equally, I wouldn't want to be regressive around that and say, well, if you have this body, then, then that means you have to do things in this way or that way. So I think the sort of sane, healthy middle ground here of acknowledging the subjective, and acknowledging that maybe not everything in the past was awful, is, that Western civilization isn't built on pure evil. The healthy sort of middle ground is as ever, perhaps where the sanity lies. But yeah, I think this is a real interesting issue for the embodiment world right now. Like, are we defined by our bodies? Do they matter at all? Does our biology matter? And, there's also really interesting stuff out of the embodiment community around things like how cycles affect people. Several female colleagues of mine are very interested in that. And, really educated me a lot around some of that stuff that I didn't know about as a male embodiment teacher. So, interesting times, slightly chaotic times. I think, if I can just speak to that more broadly, the chaos of the times means that the anchor of the body becomes more appealing. So I feel like in a way, I think embodiment's is trending in this time of complete chaos, because there's something very concrete about right, my body,
Yeah.
And it's also at the heart. We didn't do the other connections earlier, but people talk about the meaning crisis right now, the mental health crisis, and both of those crises have disconnection at the heart.
Yes.
And knowing what matters to you, knowing being rooted in yourself, being able to self-regulate is at the heart of, everyone seems to have anxiety and various other conditions these days, and self-regulation is through the body. That's how you self-regulate. And the trauma awareness piece is really increasing, which is fantastic. And I've pushed that for years. But again, like anything, could be taken too far. If we take the sort of safe space culture from the American universities and try and transcribe that to sort of normal life, I just don't think it works.
No, were you trying to make sure there's triggers nowhere?
Right.
Yeah.
Life's triggering. Maybe I get triggered because you're wearing a white shirt and, I don't know, someone tapped me in a white shirt once. So it doesn't mean you can't wear a white shirt, right? So it's, there's a sort of authoritarian quality to some of the politics that's coming out now. But I think it is, there's a well-intended part to it too. which is to allow for difference, to allow for different kinds of people, different kinds of bodies. The body positivity movement's been very, very strong. And, I really support that, that, you don't have to have a six-pack to do embodiment, No,
that all makes sense. So it is I'm really glad you've given that context. It's given me more of an insight as to why this is so edgy. I hadn't quite seen why this was particularly controversial to that particular movement, but that makes so much sense. So knowing that and keeping that kind of balance, I guess, of the sort of subjectivity and the objectivity in mind. When I first connected with you, I was saying it would be really lovely to dive into what does that mean, whether we call it kind of masculine, feminine, men, women, but just to have an honest conversation that's around that, because I find that in the embodiment community, no one seems to really want to go there. And in the polarity community, aren't really able to have the conversation at the level of detail that I'm looking for.
Exactly. They're not able to give you the actual... Dylan's great on this in terms of, I tend to work with, I talk about yin and yang. And the reason I talk about yin and yang is it's more gender neutral. So, most, we'd say yin men do not want to be called feminine. Right? They just might not like that. And the same with what you might call masculine women. So I tend to talk about yin and yang because it keeps the language pretty neutral. And first of all, clarifying yin and yang, it's constantly moving. One is at the heart of the other, and it's always situational. So immediately we've just gone into a level of complexity that most people can't handle, which is just going to mean that many of your audience probably can though, which would mean that misunderstandings and accusations get very easy. So one is at the heart of the other, meaning it's not about opposites. It's a polarity. It's different. It's constantly moving. Yeah. So it's, night and day, it's rest and work, whatever. And it's very situational. So it's, right now we're in a situation where I'm the guest and you're doing more of the listening. So there's a yin yang polarity. Now, as if you came as a guest on my show, that might reverse. So given that it's situational, relational, shifting, and paradoxical at its core, now let's talk about polarity. If anyone's still with us,
I love that. Okay, I'm completely up for that. So, do you feel? And we both share a friend in Darren Diogi. Yeah. We've both spoken to about gender and these kinds of things. Do you have a sense that there is a bias in each person to being, and I'm very happy to use the language you just had, to be more yin or more yang in general?
Sure. I'm not an expert on gender, so I'm not going to talk about that. A, because it would get me in a world of shit. But B, because just genuinely with humility, it's not my expertise. And I really believe one should only talk about in a professional context, or rather than just down the pub, me, you and Darren hanging out. That's Darren's expertise. It's not mine. I definitely see, though, tendencies in people, cultures, and places. When I'm in New York, that's a yang city. So is Moscow. Brighton is much more yin than London. I definitely see tendencies with people. I do see far more women that I think have a more yin core, shall we say, and far more men that have a more yang essence. However, it's situational. It's constantly changing. And I think the ideal is to have a degree of fluidity, because otherwise we're a caricature. We're stuck. We're a hammer and everything's a nail. So I'm teaching students two things. One is to accept and love their nature. And the other one is to build range. And I think if you do one of those two things, you're doing yourself or your students a disservice. So on the one hand, to go, you know what, I'm pretty yang. I like to do things. I like striving. I'm, penetrative in my manner. That's okay. I'm not a broken yin person. Whereas a more yin person, and you can see it in the body normally, there's lots of body indicators like muscle tone, how the eyes are and the tilt of the head, and there's a million indicators. It's just probably, I've got students who are just really yin and they're amazingly better listeners than I am and always will be. And they need to maybe build a bit of range so they can establish their boundaries and get what they want. And, they need to build at least the capacity for that and not outsource it to a partner. I've worked quite like the gay community, particularly in Russia. and also in Brighton where I live, which is a gay capital, as you probably know.
Yeah.
Gay community, like you can't get away from polarity. It's just there, and it's the basis of a lot of stereotypes, but it's also like an unavoidable fact.
Oh yeah, that must be super interesting. So I love everything you've just said there, and I love the way also you keep sort of pointing in various ways towards context and environment, which I think is, I don't know if you've seen it, there's something I saw on Facebook last week that was talking about how we typically, when we do studies around kind of, I don't know, perception, the way the mind works, they're often through a lens of often Western and often kind of young students just because they're available to the researchers. Yeah. And it was comparing the difference between the ways that someone in the West has this perception that's very kind of like individual centric versus someone in a more kind of like traditional Eastern culture where they have a much more holistic perspective, where something's seen in relationships to its environment much more. And which I thought was fascinating. And I'm really noticing now how my own tendency, because I guess being raised in the West, is to kind of go to like the thing itself and not notice its environment, not notice its context. I'm really picking up as you're talking, like, oh, that's so interesting that you are including, like not just including it, saying it's like actually vitally important. Almost like we, maybe I'm taking this another level too far, but we almost like can't exist in like an embodied level without taking into account the environment we're existing within or embodied within.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes I talk about it, the body's a verb, and that is a process which is interacting with other processes and place, and definitely relational webs and communities. So we speak to each other, but you know, that's a necessary and convenient illusion of separateness. And the more you study embodiment, the more that starts to seem absurd. You know, another disconnection we haven't talked about yet is the disconnection from the planet. You know, that would be a bigger one. And I wouldn't necessarily say it's Western. I mean, for example, like I've worked in about 50 countries and I've lived in 7 or 8. And like Spanish culture, for example, is way more communal. You know, there's a communality there to it that might not exist. I mean, American and the 2 most individualistic cultures in the world, as measured by people who study this, are Israel and the United States. And a lot of the embodiment work has come out of the United States. And the culture blindness tends to be I'd say a bit of a weak spot for most of the American embodiment teachers, who are most of them, along with humor. But the a bit bitchy here, but that tends to be a weak spot, is the cultural blindness, because they tend to see things as the individual and almost see any kind of discussion of culture as some kind of prejudice, you know. So I think bringing in culture, which has been very obvious to me, I teach the same something called the Embodied Facilitator Course in England and the same course in Russia. And Russians, I could pass as Russian if I don't smile and wear Adidas, right? But it's like, we look pretty similar. It's like, I love Russian. It's such a great language. My wife's Ukrainian as well, so I've been there like 20 plus times. But culturally, they're pretty different from us. They're pretty different. And that teaching embodiment, that's become obvious. Now, there's some cross-cultural stuff, like we work with the fight or flight response, which is pretty universal. But there is a whole bunch of cultural stuff, and I find that fascinating. And look about polarity. I mean, that's in Russian and Slavic cultures generally, they've got a different approach to that. And in some ways, it's a relief to me, because I can be that like masculine, kind of yang male guy, and people not only don't mind, they love it. Whereas if I try that in Berlin or Stockholm or Amsterdam, someone tries to cut my balls off pretty quick, So it's I never thought it would be a relief to be in Putin's Russia, but sometimes it can feel almost like energetically, you can feel, the sweet air of Russian freedom.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, so going back to what you're saying, it makes real sense that having that range it is just, I guess, more juicy and fun and alive anyway. Yeah. But also noticing different contexts are going to call for different things. And I think you've given some really great examples of how that's the case.
Yeah, and I think if my approach to embodiment generally is awareness, range, and choice. Become aware of your patterns, become aware of what you tend to do, then build some possibilities. and then have some choices. And it can be like, hey, do I want to be really yang right now, really yin? Or we use a 4 elements model to make it from 2 to 4. You know, Dylan has a 16 kind of model. So, you know, different models, but you're basically looking at the same thing, which is noticing your habits and then saying, right now, is this really what fits? And maybe over a longer time frame, developing something. So the Russian businesswoman who'd become very yang through being in business as an executive was clearly very successful if she was sitting next to me on the flight and, you know, doing well for herself. But that wasn't working for her interpersonally. And I said, listen, you're a kick-ass businesswoman. I can see that. You've got that yang side. But I also had the sense that it wasn't really what was most true for her. It's something she'd learned. So she'd already built some range, but then she'd almost taken it too far. So I suggested she take up a dance form and actually practice being a follower. And practice it, you know, because she liked the idea of dancing. She used to dance when she was a teenager, she was telling me. And partner dance is quite common in Russia. And, you know, I said, look, that might be a practice to build that embodiment of remembering your more yin side. And then maybe you'll attract the kind of partners who you want. And I said, unless you want more yin men, in which case just keep doing what you're doing. Because you almost spat at that point. You know? And there's so many people I meet who are like this. They're like, at their core, they don't want what society is now telling them. You know, like every Hollywood movie I'm seeing now has got these like super sensitive yin guys in and super kick-ass yang women. And I'm glad that there's these yang women because if you're one of those women who's like that, like I think my niece might be like that. She's got role models now, which is really good. She can be like, you know, the new Star Wars person or whoever. And it's like, that's really good. You know, I'm glad there's some range there. But when it's like 100% of the people in all the movies, I'm like, okay, that isn't actually what 3/4 maybe of people are really longing for. And I think those 3/4 are not wrong. They're not broken. I think all of human history wasn't a mistake. And that's controversial to say that maybe, but fuck it.
Yeah, no, oh my goodness, I love that so much. And I was thinking, bit similar to the Russian businesswoman, my own experience was, I think, and this is probably true as you're saying for most, I think I've got a lot of both, a lot of yin and a lot of yang, but for various reasons, I was raised by a single man. I did a lot of martial arts. I kind of saw that the way to be successful was to like really lean heavily into building that yang side of me. And it's been really interesting over the last few years, intentionally cultivating my ability to kind of like soften back into that yin side, which it's been interesting because initially it felt really unfamiliar, like this isn't natural. And then as the years have gone by, I'm like, it is. It's just I'm so used to only practicing my yang.
Well, this is the other thing. These cycles can be daily. Like I work really, really hard, but what a lot of people don't know is like I'm a spa connoisseur. I have a bubble bath every night.
Oh, lovely.
Right, like I need that yin part of my day. And I tend to be attracted to very yin women because there's also relational polarity there, you know, and I tend to have business partners who are relatively yin for the same reason. So we're not just bashing heads, but also it's times of life. And that businesswoman may be at a turning point that's been going on for 10 years. And she might spend the next 10 years, you know, taking up yoga and being super yin and learning emotional intelligence. And she might go, and normally there's a sort of Hegelian like point, counterpoint integration. You know, people go one way and then they go too fast, they go the other way, and then they try to integrate it. And maybe society is trying to do that right now. If I was going to be generous, I'd say society is trying to kind of integrate that right now. It's trying to sort of, you know, and then the optimist in me thinks that maybe we just have to go through 5 pretty painful years where some of this stuff gets worked out. But you know, actually, the majority of people, the majority of women I speak to, still love masculine men, and the majority of men I speak to still love the women with the more yin side of things. And it's okay to be different. It's okay to have range and to change. But let's not deny what is bloody obvious, and it's still the majority of people.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh wow! I could honestly, I think we're running to the end of the show, but I could literally
flown by, huh? I could go a little longer if you need to, but it's flown by.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating conversation. So, how about? I appreciate there's only so much we can do justice to in this format, but you were talking about, I think you said awareness, practice, and choice. What were your 3 things you said?
Yeah, it's just awareness and choice for self and other, or you can look at awareness, range and choice.
Well, yeah, range and choice. Would you be able to give listeners just some like practical kind of examples or a little, steps that they can
Sure.
use?
So listeners, if you're walking, listening to this, notice how you're walking. And is that the kind of walking that's building the mood you want to be in, the state you want to be in? If not, change your walk. Not Ministry of Silly Walks, but for example, it could be something as simple as slowing down, pushing a little bit more from the back foot to get a bit more yang, or feeling into the feet, or adding a little playfulness to the walk, or adding a little softness and fluidity to the legs. Nothing that even has to look weird. You can do that while just walking along. Or maybe it's notice your breath. Like right now, how's my breath? Where am I breathing in my body? What's moving? And then, do you want a calmer, deeper, slower breath, more of a yin breath? Or do you actually want to energize, a bit more yang, a bit more pushing and pulling, a bit higher in the chest? Now, can't see the listeners' rights, but they can choose for themselves. Really okay. Or we can even just access a little body wisdom right now, like notice your body and what part of you is calling for attention. And you can put your hand there, or you can put your attention there if it's not appropriate. And it might just be something simple like, hey, my neck aches, I'm going to get a massage. Or it might be something like, I'm feeling a bit lonely, I want to connect with my wife tonight properly. Or my gut's telling me something intuitive here. Or like tune in, like I can give you models and advanced trainings, but simple stuff like this.
I love that.
I give you a few sort of simple things that I got. It's interesting when I wrote the book. Just sorry to plug that again. When I wrote the book, originally it was like theory, and then people said it needed more color, so I added the personal stuff, like life story stuff, and my own life story is a sort of arc from super cognitive to more embodied, and from traumatized to trauma healed. And then people said, yeah, but just give us something we can do. So I added a whole nother chapter, which I've now put through on the internet, which is like top quick win tips. It's like 10 things to do walking, 10 things to do at your computer when you're stressed at your computer, 3 things anyone can do, 1 thing to teach your single mum friend when she's got 30 seconds. It's like real quick wins on that chapter, which I just went, you know what? A lot of people don't need philosophy, man. They just need to stop for 30 seconds and take a breath, or they need to stand up and stretch, or, like little hacks. Like sometimes I'll like do a lot of my coaching while walking around the park, as opposed to sat at my desk. And so I tried to include some real sort of less philosophical or less personal, like quick wins in there too.
I think going back to what you were saying earlier, like all of this is in the experience. And for some people, that is the way in. The doorway might be to have just a slightly different experience, a bit more of an aware, consciously chosen experience of their body than they normally have. And that can be enough for them to think, I want to have more of that. Yoga.
Yoga is so popular around the world because people walk in and they walk out feeling different. Yoga gives people that bit of a buzz. And then there's disadvantage, like people can get addicted to certain kinds of yoga, and yoga can even become disembodied. But generally, people are walking in, they're feeling their bodies. That in itself is profound, even though it can be a bit painful if you're cut off to feel. It's like, coming home, but also your body's like, where have you been,
Yeah.
But in it, there's a humanizing in that. And then nearly always walking out feeling better than when you walked in, going, you know what, I feel more resourced to deal with, people's lives aren't easy. Do you know what I mean? People have little tragedies, people have big tragedies. Life's difficult, life's busy, just as talking to just a single mum yesterday, as that was on my mind. She's just getting through her day is hard work, And it's just a few little things like that, even if she's able to do like a very simple little stretching thing, and it's like, that can be, I see the whole world is really kind of coming home this way. And the ethical implications that means we're also coming home to each other. We're getting less psychopathic, and also hopefully coming home to some sense of meaning to the planet, and maybe to some sense of something bigger, to spirit. They're the 5 reconnections to circle around to that theme for the leaders like me, for listeners like me who will be listening going, we didn't say all 5. So, that's why I do this. And I feel like there's something worthwhile in that, worthwhile happening in that reconnection.
Yeah. I remember once I read this what I'm about to say is going to sound so silly, but sometimes you read a line and you suddenly like see it or feel it at another level deeper. I read something that said like, the body can only ever be now. Yeah. And it just hit me with a whole level of like, oh my goodness, I'd never seen that before. That, people talk so much about being present, being in the now and all the rest of it. And it's like, if we're in the body, we can't help but be here in the now. And yeah, and it's just, I think you're right. I think there's a level of, I guess, empowerment, sovereignty even, that we feel once we start to reconnect to the body, where all these things can sound so, like when people talk about the transformations or the problems they've got, and to like just know the amount of sovereignty we've each got to choose, like how embodied we are moment to moment, like, wow.
Well, it's the primary form of sovereignty. That's why people who would want to control others, like in the military or when you get kids to sit in classroom, the first thing they do is control the body. They control the postures of the body. They, restrictive clothing, restrictive movement. This is absolutely the first thing if you're trying to control people. And it's absolutely necessary for freedom. I mean, if insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result, well, actually, it's even deeper than that. It's not just what you do. It's who you are is the same over and over again. So unless we can work with that level, we're fundamentally not free. So for me, yes, there is that. It's the only game in town for being free as far as I can tell. So, worth doing.
Yeah, completely. Oh, I think you're going to have to come back on because there's like just so many places I want to take this.
Okay, no problem. This was a joy. So no problem at all.
So where can people find out more about you and your book and your conference and everything else? Where can they go?
So the book launches today. If this is out on the day we think it will be out, it's 28th of November. And you can go to theembodimentbook.com and there's some of the image graphics that you can't show on a podcast there. People really like all the different embodiment practices laid out, the embodied intelligence model laid out. And there's a couple of free chapters so people can get a taste. Or if you just want to go to Amazon and buy it there, it's, normal. It's just called Embodiment, Moving Beyond Mindfulness. Generally, the Embodiment Conference, which is going to be massive, 1,000 speakers. So that's speakers, not participants.
Whoa.
And that is up online. If you just Google the Embodiment Conference, the Embodiment Conference is a Facebook group. If someone's a yoga teacher, they should look up Embodied Yoga Principles. If someone's a coach or a trainer, they should look up Embodied Facilitator Course. And last but not least, I have the Embodiment podcast. If people like podcasts, like I imagine they like yours, then that might be interesting to them too. So there's lots there. But the main thing I'm sort of saying at the moment is the book, The Embodiment Book. And you can find that on Amazon.
Oh, amazing.
A lot of stuff there. Much. So I thought different people need sort of
I'd much rather you do that. Yeah. And thank you so much for everything you do.
A real pleasure. I mean, you've been one of the more embodied interviewers I've had, if you don't mind me saying. So it's nice when someone like you keep kind of, listeners might not be able to get it, but I can see that you keep like checking in with yourself about like what's landing and what's true for me and which way is the conversation flowing. And that leads to this is a nice micro example of embodiment. It leads to a much more interesting conversation than if I'm just repeating canned spam, like some sort of not authentic, not real, not in the moment. And if you're doing what you have planned, which might not actually be a good thing to do, it's actually a much more real conversation. So I've enjoyed this.
Oh, thank you. And thank you for kind of creating some altitude there to give this as an example. Love that. Thank you.
Well, but do something live, right? Why not? Okay.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. Have a great day and enjoy your bubble bath later.
Pleasure. Take care. Bye-bye.
Wow. Loved that episode. Mark is just incredibly knowledgeable. And I think embodiment has got to be one of my favourite topics. The 5 ways that Mark describes that we can be connected are self, meaning, others, planet, and spirit. And clearly being connected or disconnected in these ways is fundamental to our lived experience. We can become more skilled with our embodiment and therefore expand our range or level of connection so that we have more choice around how we show up in different contexts and environments. Choosing in to be more embodied can be as simple as noticing how you're currently sitting, standing, breathing, or feeling, and making small shifts to create a different experience. If you'd like to get the notes and links to everything we spoke about this week, hop on over to the show notes, and they're at primalhappiness.co/episode 261. And if you're feeling ready to go deeper with myself and Jonathan to reclaim your primal power and actualize your deepest gifts, go along to primalhappiness.co/go deeper. If you don't want to miss out next week's episode, head on over to Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Stitcher, or your Android or iOS app of choice and hit that subscribe button. That way you'll get each episode delivered straight to your device as soon as it's released. Thank you so much for listening. You've been wonderful. Catch you again next Tuesday.